No.
How about now?
Yeah.
All right. Hey, thanks for coming back. This is I almost really like the devil. So thanks so much for being here, and thank you as well for to Tusculum University, President Humble and Dr. Shumate and Dr. Williams. Thank you for being such good hosts. Also, Mike handling the sound in the back. Mike is a good name for a sound man, I guess. Thank you for doing such a good job. It's been a really incredibly pleasant experience for me. I felt so welcome, and thank you all for being here. And you've been really kind. Gosh, if my students, I could have said my students were this interested and eager. Like President Humble, they don't show up for class unless I threaten them with policies and penalties on the syllabus. Of course, I don't talk about Satan every day either, so I didn't teach a class on Satan there. There was a little bit of buzz on campus when I was talking about Satan in class, but it's really good to be here. I hope you like my jacket. It is my Satan jacket. It's also my Christmas jacket. I don't think he's mine. He's celebrating his birth and talking about Satan's jacket. Also, it works for Valentine's Day. I don't know how my wife feels about it. I should probably ask her how she feels about me wearing my Satan jacket on Valentine's Day. But today we're going to do the New Testament. This is where we kind of wrap it all up. What we've been doing so far is talking about what people believed about Satan, what people said about Satan, beginning from the very earliest texts that mention Satan, which are the Old Testament texts, going through the Old Testament, through early Jewish literature, and into the New Testament, and we're wrapping up with the New Testament. Today, it's tricky dealing with the New Testament because on the one hand, in the New Testament, we find some teachings that are a little different from what we've had in the Old Testament. And so the New Testament is really important for filling in some of our beliefs, some of our doctrines about Satan, with some ideas that we don't have elsewhere in the Bible. It's tricky, though, because I don't want to give anyone the impression that the New Testament is more important than the Old Testament, or that the New Testament is more authoritative theologically than the Old Testament is, because it's all part of the Bible for me, and they're all equally informative and equally authoritative for me. But in the New Testament, we do find some things that we don't have in the Old Testament. So I think it's fitting that we finish with the New Testament, both from a historical, chronological standpoint, but also from a theological standpoint. And just to remind you kind of what I'm doing, I've told my students this before, what I'm really after here is trying to figure out what the Bible says about these topics. I don't have a theological axe to grind. I'm not trying to make anyone agree with me theologically, or I'm not trying to promote any sort of theology, any specific or particular brand of it. I'm just really after what these biblical texts say about it. Now, sometimes what these texts say is going to sound very, very traditional, the sorts of things that you would expect the biblical texts to say based on your time that you spend in the church and studying the Bible in a church context. Sometimes what these texts say are a little different from what we would expect them to say. But what I'm after is what the text says, whether it's what I expected it to say or what what my tradition tells me that it ought to say or not. So let's do that. Before let me give you the title for the first part of the lecture. This is the basics of New Testament theology. So what we're going to be talking about at the beginning are some of the easier things, I think, to wrap our minds around that the New Testament says about Satan. By the way, I don't know that Satanology is a real word. I may have just made that up, but we're going to call it Satanology. So the first part will be the basics of New Testament Satanology. The second part, we're going to deal with some more complex facets of New Testament Satanology. We are, for both sessions, going to situate, okay, let's see, it goes this way. There. We are going to situate the New Testament teaching in its early Jewish context. And so we're going to recap some of what we've talked about up to this point, just to make sure we're all on the same page as we're moving forward and ready to understand what the New Testament teaches in light of what has been said about Satan prior to the time of the New Testament and around the same time of the New Testament in early Jewish texts. This is the Old Testament, by the way. The Old Testament, these are the 39 books of the Old Testament as they are traditionally counted in Christian tradition. Do y'all remember how many of these books I told you the figure called the Satan appears in the Old Testament? See what, this is the first week. 2 of them, that's right. Zechariah and Job. Now, just for the sake of getting us started, let me compare this with the New Testament. Here is the New Testament. And there are only 27 books in the New Testament, so there are fewer books in the New Testament. How many of them do you think mention Satan? Not all of them, just so you know. I know someone's saying all of them, not all of them. How many of them mention Satan? 1, 2, 15, 20. That's close. 19. So about 2/3 of the New Testament books mention Satan. Only 2 of 39 books in the Old Testament mention Satan. I like these statistics or these numbers because they illustrate a very important point. Something has changed about the way people are thinking about Satan between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Satan has become really important theologically. Satan isn't a major figure in the Old Testament. Only 2 Old Testament authors even bother to mention Satan. But in the New Testament, you have nearly every New Testament author mentioning Satan, and 2/3 of the books mentioning him somewhere. There is one scholar, by the way, who says there are 20 books in the New Testament that mention Satan. And he says that Colossians also mentions Satan. Colossians talks about the kingdom of the world or something like that. And he says that this implies that there is a king of that kingdom and implicitly mentions Satan. I don't count that. So you could say 20, but 19 mentions Satan explicitly. All right, let's survey where we've come over the lecture series and talk about how the New Testament fits into that. First of all, week number 1. In the Old Testament, the Satan is conceived of as an attacker or executioner of the wicked. Satan works for God, punishing sinners. That's what we have going on in the book of Zechariah. That's what seems to be presumed by the book of Job, although Satan gets special permission in the book of Job to cause problems for an innocent person. In early Judaism, Satan continues to be regarded as a punisher of sinners, but is also depicted in the following ways. Satan is a deceiver or tempter. We saw this in the book of Jubilees and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Satan doesn't just punish sinners, but he leads people to commit sins and then punishes them. We saw that Satan is the enemy of God and God's people. There was a Dead Sea Scroll called the War Scroll, or the Rule of War, that talks about Satan as God's enemy, someone who's going to be a recipient of God's wrath. Now, let me add a couple of things to this that we haven't talked about yet, but I think are going to be helpful for us as we discuss the New Testament today. So the third thing, we have Satan is conceived of initially as an attacker executioner. He becomes a sort of deceiver and tempter and an enemy of God's people in early Jewish literature. Also, what we haven't talked about yet, this was actually on the PowerPoint for last week, but we ended up spending a little more time doing questions, and so we didn't get to this. But early Jewish texts insert the Satan into several Old Testament stories from which this figure was originally absent. Now, that's kind of complicated. Surely I could have come up with a better way to word that. But what I mean here is early Jews are interpreting Old Testament passages, and they're interpreting Old Testament passages that don't mention Satan, but they're saying that Satan was involved in these stories, even though the Old Testament doesn't mention Satan. Let me give you just a few examples. One of the books that we've talked about is Jubilees. Jubilees 17 is based on Genesis 22. The book of Jubilees is interpreting Genesis, retelling the stories of Genesis. Genesis 22 is the story of the binding and the near sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. You know, when God tests Abraham and has Abraham, well, when he tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Abraham demonstrates that he's willing to do this, and then God stops him. The book of Jubilees, written in the 2nd century BC, also tells this story, and here's how this story goes in the book of Jubilees. There are voices in heaven regarding Abraham that he was faithful, sorry for the title there, was faithful in everything that he told them, that the Lord loved him, and that in every difficulty he was faithful. The Prince Mastema, that's Jubilees' name for Satan, the Prince Mastema came and said before God, Abraham does indeed love his son Isaac and finds him more pleasing than anyone else. Tell him to offer him as a sacrifice on an altar. Then you will see whether he performs this order and will know whether he is faithful in everything through which you test him. So according to Jubilees, the reason that God tests Abraham by having Abraham offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice is because Satan goes to God and says, God, you don't really know if Abraham loves you as much as you think he does. If you test Abraham by having him sacrifice his son, then you'll know whether Abraham really loves you or not. Now, what book does this sound like? Job. Sounds like Job, doesn't it? And what the author of Jubilees has done here is he's looked at Genesis 22 and this test of Abraham and says, you know what, this sounds kind of like Job. I bet Satan was involved in Genesis 22 as well. When God has this really difficult test for someone, God doesn't just do that, but Satan instigates that sort of thing. And so we have several stories like this where an early Jewish interpreter looks at an Old Testament story and says, you know what, I bet Satan was involved there. Look at this story in Jubilees 48, which is based on Exodus 4. Now, Exodus 4 is a really weird story, so I'm going to put Exodus 4 up here first. Exodus 4, verses 24 through 26. God tells Moses, go to Egypt, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. So Moses sets out from Midian to Egypt to do what God has told, and then we have this really, really weird story. It says, on the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin, touched his feet with it, and said, truly you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. So God has sent Moses to Egypt to rescue Israel. And on his way to Egypt, while Moses is on his way to Egypt, God comes to Moses intending to kill him. And by circumcising her son, apparently Zipporah is able to save Moses' life. This is a really, really weird story. What does Jubilees do with it? Here we have an angel speaking to Moses. You know who spoke to you at Mount Sinai and what the Prince Mastema wanted to do to you while you were returning to Egypt. On the way at the shady fir tree, did he not wish with all his strength to kill you and to save the Egyptians from your power? Because he saw that you were sent to carry out punishment and revenge on the Egyptians, and I rescued you from his power. So according to Jubilees, it's not God trying to kill Moses, but Satan trying to kill Moses, and one of God's angels actually rescues Moses from Satan, or the prince of Mastema. Interesting. Jubilees 48, verses 7 through 9. This is based on Exodus 7 through 13. These are the story of the 10 plagues that come on Egypt. What you have in the book of Exodus is when Moses does certain plagues, the Egyptian magicians are able to replicate some of them. They're able to imitate some of Moses' plagues, which is part of the reason that Pharaoh isn't as impressed with Moses and with Moses' God as he ought to be. What it says in Jubilees is this. Everything happened by your word. 10 great and severe punishments came to the land of Egypt so that you could take revenge on it for Israel. The prince of Mastema would stand up against you and wish to make you fall into the Pharaoh's power. He would help the Egyptian magicians, and they would oppose you and perform in front of you. So how were the Egyptian magicians able to do some of the same miraculous, wondrous works that Moses was able to do by God's power? Yeah, according to the book of Jubilees, it was Satan or the prince of Mastima who was helping the Egyptian magicians. Now, Exodus doesn't say this, but Jubilees is reading Exodus and thinking, you know what? I bet Satan was involved there. One last passage. After the Passover, the death of all the Egyptian firstborn, Pharaoh finally lets Israel go. However, Pharaoh has a change of heart. And actually, my choice of the word heart there is intentional because that is what actually changes in Exodus 14. And what it says here, God tells Moses, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them so that I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, and they did so. This is a fun passage to discuss with my students in my Bible class. What does it mean that God hardened Pharaoh's heart here? And what are the theological implications? Well, here's what it meant for Jubilees. He, the prince of Mastima, stiffened their resolve and made them stubborn. So it's the prince of Mastima who actually hardened Pharaoh's heart. Working together with God, then it says they were made stubborn by the Lord our God, so that he could strike the Egyptians and throw them into the sea. So who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Well, God kind of, but also the prince of Mastima or the Satan. So we have several stories like this, and Jubilees is not the only book that does this. Jubilees just happens to contain some examples that are pretty easy to throw up here this morning. But one of the things that's going on in early Judaism, not only are they talking about Satan more as a tempter and as a leader of evil spirits and as God's enemy, but they're talking about Satan as someone who's involved in some of the Old Testament stories that Satan wasn't mentioned in initially. The book of Exodus does not mention Satan, but here you have 3 or 4 places where the book of Jubilees says Satan was involved in the story of the Exodus. All right, one more thing, and then we get to move on to the New Testament. And we've already seen this illustrated by the slides I had up there before. The Satan and other spiritual beings become very prominent in the theology of many Jews. Very, very prominent. The New Testament doesn't just start talking about Satan out of nowhere. Other Jews writing theological texts, writing stories and interpreting the Bible during this era, they were fascinated with Satan. They were very intrigued by Satan and the potential theologically that this doctrine had for explaining some of the problems they encounter, some of the stories in the Old Testament. And Satan begins to figure fundamentally and centrally in the theology and the religious thinking of early Jews. And so when we come to the New Testament, also written largely, if not entirely, by early Jews, they're thinking about Satan a lot. And Satan is very important for them theologically. Now, Satan's not as important as God. I mean, of course, God is the most important in the New Testament. Jesus Christ is certainly fundamental to New Testament theology, but Satan also figures prominently in there and receives quite a bit of attention, certainly more attention than Satan receives in the Old Testament. All right. Are we ready to begin talking about the New Testament now? Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering whether Satan provoked, if not tempted, God.
We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about, toward the end, the second part of our discussion this morning, when we're doing the more complex questions, we're going to talk about Satan's role as the accuser. And so when Satan goes before God and incites God to test people, how are we supposed to think about that? So we'll get to that question in a sense. Feel free to ask it again if it doesn't get answered. Good. Yes, ma'am.
Is Satan mentioned in the history of the Jews by Josephus?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't think so. And unless he's talking about Zechariah or Job or something like that, I don't remember coming across that. So I don't think so. But I can't tell you 100% for sure. Yeah, take a look at it. It'll take you a while. But go for it. Go for it. People, do you have a copy of Josephus at home? Do you have a copy of Josephus at home?
Yes.
That's great. That used to be really, people would have a copy of the Bible and Josephus. Those were like the most common texts to be held and to be possessed in a home.
That's why
Yeah.
that's what I understand. It came down from a Jewish ancestor, not German ancestors. And so. History.
That's cool. Cool. Well, happy reading.
Well, no,
All right. All right. Let's see here. Let's start off by talking about terminology. We can learn about what the New Testament authors are thinking about Satan by the words that they use to talk about Satan. Does that make sense? So what is Satan called in the New Testament? Now, the first little bit is a little tricky. The New Testament does call Satan the Satan. Satan was the Hebrew word, but the New Testament authors would transliterate that word, not translate the word, but transliterate it, meaning take the Hebrew word and spell it with Greek characters. So the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, the New Testament written in Greek, and I apologize, I know some of you know this very, very well. But just for clarity, the Old Testament written in Hebrew, New Testament written in Greek. The Greek writings of the New Testament would sometimes use the Hebrew word Satan and just spell it with Greek characters. And that's what I mean by transliterate. And so Satan is referred to as ha-Satanas, or the Satan. Now, Satan is also, I'm going the wrong direction. Satan is also called Satan. So for the first time, it appears that we have Satan being used as a name in the New Testament, not as a title. So the Satan is like the attacker, the executioner, something like that. But in the New Testament, for the first time, we very likely have the name Satan. Now, it's difficult to tell in the Greek when the word is the Satan and when the word is just Satan, because in Greek, they often have the word the before people's names. So if you're reading about Jesus, sometimes it says the Jesus or the James or the Barnabas. Now, we don't translate it that way in English because that would be bad English. So when you have ha-Satanas, is it the Satan or is it just the name Satan? And it's not always clear. But occasionally it does seem that the name Satan is involved. If you want to hear my reasoning for that, my book deals with this. The last chapter of my book talks about how you can tell whether it's a name or not. And you can't ultimately tell, but it gives a little more of my explanation for why I do think it is used as a name in the New Testament, but also why it can be used as the title, the Satan. Now, the new thing we have in the New Testament is the word diabolos, or ha-diabolos, which is the devil. Now, what does the word diabolos mean? I think that based on the way diabolos is used in other Greek literature, the way that related terms are used in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, I think that diabolos was simply supposed to be a translation of Satan. I don't think the authors were trying to do a whole lot more theologically than simply offer a Greek translation of the word Satan. So when you read devil in the New Testament, it's referring to the same person as Satan. There's a book that recently came out, and the person suggests that maybe the devil is one person and Satan is another person. That just doesn't hold water. And you'll see in some of the texts we're getting ready to read that Satan and the devil are the same person. And devil, or diabolos, is simply a translation, a Greek translation of Satan. Now, one thing that the word devil does that Satan doesn't is the word diabolos. It can refer to someone who's harming someone else or someone who's just a general adversary of someone else, kind of like the word Satan does. But the word diabolos can also refer to someone who is a slanderer or accuser. And so I think that although when Satan is translated as diabolos, I think they're just trying to translate what Satan means. But they're using a word that can also mean to slander or accuse, which does open the door or help precipitate this idea that the devil is a slanderer. We haven't seen that quite yet, the devil slandering someone or accusing someone, depending on what sense we make of Job. But I think once we have diabolos used as Satan, then all of a sudden there's a little more room for understanding one of this figure's main functions as slander and accusation. Let me use some smaller type of some more phrases. So we talked about Satan and Satan. We talked about the devil or diabolos. Other terminology for Satan, the tempter, because Satan tempts people, deceives people, tests people. The accuser, the dragon, the ancient serpent, these are all from Revelation chapter 12, which I believe we'll look at near the end of our time. The evil one and the enemy, which, these designations seem to imply that Satan's not just working for God. There's more going on than that. Satan's not just going around harming sinners. He's evil, and he's the enemy. So these are really theologically significant. The strangest one in the Bible, the one that I do not entirely understand, it occurs in Ephesians, the prince of the power of the air. There's no other designation for Satan like this in the literature that I consider, in the Bible or outside of the Bible. But this does seem to be another designation for Satan, the prince of the power of the air, the ruler of this world, the god of this age. Then you have names, Beliar. Maybe you remember from the Dead Sea Scrolls last week, Belial. This is kind of the Greek version of that, Beliar. And Beelzebub, which there is some debate about this, but most scholars seem to conclude that Beelzebub is a name for Satan. We come across Beelzebub in Mark 3, where Jesus is casting out demons. And some of the Jewish leaders say that he's doing this by the power of Beelzebub, the chief of demons. So this seems to be another big thing. Yes?
Is there any use of the prince of the power of the air in Greek literature?
That's a good question. I haven't come across it. And the commentators that are reading it, who probably done a more exhaustive search for that particular title than I have, haven't mentioned that. So if you come across that, let me know. We'll publish an article together. All right, let me summarize now what the New Testament says about Satan. Those are the titles, and those will help us as we're moving forward. But let's talk about what the New Testament says about Satan. First of all, Satan is a person. Now, for some of you, you're saying, when I was a kid, we would say, no duh. That was what we would say when something was just blatantly obvious. Satan is a person. For others of you, maybe this is seems a little more suspicious. Believing that Satan is actually a person who's out in the world causing us to do bad things and harming people, that's out of fashion in post-enlightenment modern thinking. It's not fashionable to believe in the supernatural, and so a lot of people, even Christians, are hesitant to believe that there are actually demons and evil spirits in the world, and that Satan is an actual person. The New Testament authors, they weren't bothered by that. The New Testament authors believed Satan was a person. And so when we're reading the Bible, whatever you want to do with it theologically yourself, when it comes to understanding what the New Testament texts are saying and what the New Testament authors are saying, they all agree that Satan is a person. There's no one who's using Satan merely as a metaphor for evil or a figure of speech or a symbol. In the minds of the New Testament authors, Satan is an actual person. So that's the first thing that we should probably, one of the most fundamental things that we probably mention. All right, Satan is a tester, tempter, and deceiver. And these are all slightly different. I think we talked last week about how testing and tempting are at least in my mind, to test someone is to try to find out their character. To tempt someone is to try to get them to respond in a certain way, not just find out their character, but get them to sin. To deceive someone, it's a little different from temptation, but you convince them that a sin is not a sin or something like that. And Satan is described doing all of these things, not only in early Jewish literature, but in the New Testament. Someone last week, and I can't remember who, one of you told me you're preaching a sermon on Matthew 4 on Sunday. Who is that? Are you doing? Oh,
It's lectionary.
Lectionary. Okay. Yeah. Matthew 4. Okay. Yeah. I didn't realize that. Okay, it's lectionary. So a number of you may be preaching on Matthew 4. So I thought I'd give you an example from Matthew 4. I'm not going to be able to I preached on this once, but it's been a while. Matthew 4, this is the temptation of Jesus by Satan in the wilderness. This also appears in the book of Mark in really short form, but fleshed out in long form like in Matthew and in Luke chapter 4. And Luke is an interesting one as well. Like what it says in Matthew 4 is Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tested by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, well, notice right there, we already have one person called the devil and the tempter. And it's not a coincidence that the devil in this passage is called the tempter, because that's exactly what the devil is going to be doing in this case. The tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, it is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, away with you, Satan. So there you have him called Satan, the devil, and the tempter, all in one passage. Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. Luke's version is slightly different from this. Luke's version has the temptations in a slightly different order. Also, with this particular temptation here, when Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, he says, if you'll bow down and worship me, I'll give them to you because they've been given to me. And so one of the ideas you have in the New Testament here is that Satan is the one who's ruling over the kingdoms of the world. And that's why you have Satan called the God of this age or the ruler of this world and some of the other texts. But Satan is the one who's in charge of all these kingdoms. He's going to give them to Jesus. Now, Jesus is going to be the king of the world, but he's going to do that in a different way. He's certainly not going to do that by worshiping Satan. But here we have a really clear example of Satan tempting people. Let me give you, for those of you who are preaching on this, let me give you just a little bit of information here that you may find interesting. In verse 2 and verses 5 through 6, Satan says, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, you will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against the stone. Jesus is here, he's hungry, he's been fasting 40 days, and essentially Satan is saying, look, you're going to starve if you don't eat something. So turn these stones to bread. Save yourself if you're the Son of God. Let God take care of you. Now look at this. Matthew chapter 27. Jesus is on the cross, and one of the thieves said to him, if you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Other people say he trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he wants to. Or he said, I am God's son. What I think is really interesting is these same temptations, at least two of them, by which Satan tempts Jesus. These are the same temptations that Jesus encounters on the cross. Not from Satan, or at least not directly from Satan. Maybe from Satan through these speakers. They're talking to Jesus, saying, "Hey, look, if you're really the Son of God, then do something about it. Save yourself. Get off the cross. Let God save you." Just like Satan saying, "Turn the stones to bread. Let God throw yourself down from the temple. Let God save you." And I just can't imagine. What if these were temptations that Jesus wasn't ready for? What if these were temptations that Jesus wasn't up to the challenge of meeting? And if Jesus faced these same temptations early in his career, and was ready and was faithful when he faced them again later in his career. It's really important for us theologically that Jesus didn't demonstrate being the Son of God by saving himself, because he saved us by not saving himself. All right. Jesus is temptation is important because those are the temptations that Jesus resisted in order to accomplish his mission and to save us. All right. Let's see here. Number 3, we have Jesus, or Satan is a person. He's tempter, tester, deceiver. Satan in the New Testament is also the leader of evil spirits / demons / angels. Now, the reason I have evil spirits / demons / angels is because the New Testament never really tells us how all of these things relate to each other. It never says that a demon and an evil angel are the same thing. So I'm trying to be careful to say he's the leader of demons / evil spirits / angels. And we have texts that refer to Satan leading these different groups. Luke chapter 13, verses 11 through 16. This is a story about Jesus healing a woman who has I think her back is bent. He does so on the Sabbath day, and that gets him into a bit of a controversy with some of the Jewish leaders. But here's what it says. Just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. So you have these evil spirits causing people physical harm, kind of like they do in early Jewish literature. Jesus heals her, and here's what Jesus says. And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage? And so this physical affliction that this woman was experiencing was caused by a spirit. And Jesus could also say this was caused by Satan, because Satan is the one who's in charge of the evil spirit. Mark 3:22, I already mentioned this briefly. Beelzebul, the ruler of demons, or Beelzebul is called the ruler of demons. Matthew chapter 25. This is the parable of the sheep and the goats, and Jesus says, then the shepherd will say to those at his left hand, you who are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Now, this is a parable about humans and the disaster that awaits those humans who are opposed to God. But the way he describes this punishment that's in store for them is that this is the eternal fire that is prepared for the devil and his angels. So we have Satan here as a leader of angels. All right, Revelation chapter 12. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon, we find out a couple of verses later, is Satan. The dragon and his angels fought back. So here we have Satan who has angels on his side associated with him. Now, these things shouldn't be that. One of the reasons I consider the things that I've listed here is the basics of New Testament Satanologies. These I think, are pretty easy to understand, and these are very similar to what we've always heard about Satan. That Satan is a person. Satan is a tester and a tempter. Satan is the leader of demons or evil spirits or angels. And so that should be pretty similar to what you've always heard. And in that respect, what you've always heard is what the New Testament teaches. Like the New Testament is consistent with that. If you've been taught that, you've been taught what the New Testament teaches, which is a good thing. Why don't we pause here, because I'm getting ready. The next slide is going to move things in a slightly more complex direction. So why don't we take a moment and take questions and make sure we're all on the same page before we move on to what is next. All right. Yes, sir.
Satan is a person and not an angel. He's not Lucifer, that was a covering cherub.
Yeah, what I mean, that's Ezekiel 28, I think you're talking about there, which is about the king of Tyre. But I would think that an angel is a person. I'm not saying he's a human. I'm saying he's a person. He's not just an impersonal entity. He's not just an idea, not just a symbol. Satan is an actual person.
Is that the same as a spirit?
Huh?
Is that the same as a spirit?
Well, we haven't really talked about that yet. Is Satan spiritual? Or, what I mean by Satan being a person is that he's not just a symbol. That Satan is real, according to Jezebel. That's what I mean. That there's a person called Satan who can move around, can talk, can do things, can think. That's what I mean by a person. Yeah, I'm not saying it's a human. No. A human being is different.
Did you say creature?
Like God is three persons, right? But God is not human, right? So Satan is also a person, but he's not a human person. I didn't expect that to be so. I apologize. Yeah. What I mean by person is not a human being, not made of flesh, not looks like me or you or anything like that. What I mean by person is that Satan has a will and a mind and can act independently. And Satan is not just a symbol or a metaphor for the bad things that happen to us. That's what I meant by that. I expected a lot of y'all to agree with that, but I didn't expect it to be confusing. Satan is not a human being. Does that clarify things? Is he a spirit? Yeah, I don't think the Bible ever uses the word spirit for Satan, but I think the assumption is that he's not a human being. And if you ask the biblical author, is Satan a spirit? They probably say yes, but they don't ever state that explicitly. Testing spirits. Yeah, there are spirits out there, and Satan is a ruler of these spirits. And I think angels are called spirits. God is called spirit. I think a spirit is a word for something that's not fleshly. And so I think they would say that Satan is spirit, but there's no text that actually says that.
But he was an angel.
You know what? The New Testament never says Satan was an angel. Isaiah refers to the king of Tyre, describing him as a cherub. That's probably a conversation for another moment. But yeah, the New Testament never says Satan is an angel. He can disguise himself as an angel of light, and he has angels associated with him. So I think the assumption is that Satan is a sort of angelic being, but the New Testament never says that explicitly. Can you see I'm trying to be careful to, like the New Testament, when it doesn't say something, I'm trying not to tell you that this is what it is. Now, if you ask the New Testament author, is Satan an angel? They probably say, yeah. What else would he do? But they never say that. They never say that explicitly. I don't think so. There is a controversial text in Ezekiel 28 that describes the king of Tyre as a guardian cherub. It's not clear that Ezekiel 28 is talking about Satan. It's also not necessarily the case that a cherub and an angel are the same thing. I think a cherub is something different from an angel. But that's a conversation. If y'all want me to talk sometime, by the way, I'm not the person talking next year. But if you want to talk sometime about angels and this kind of thing in general, I'm happy to talk with y'all about that. I have a lecture on this. What is an angel? What is a cherub? What is a seraph? And these are probably different things. We call them all angels, but the Bible called them different things. Yeah. Yes.
So you used definite articles for your list of Satan's, the names given. I'm wondering about indefinite articles such as a liar or a murderer.
Yeah.
Put those on the list, or what would you say about that?
That's a great question. I didn't put those on the list. I was thinking of that more as a word that's describing Satan rather than a title or an appellative for Satan. So that's why those didn't make the list. We could certainly make a very lengthy list if we included these other things. Satan was a murderer, a liar. He's the father of lies. That may be deep. Anyway, but there's other things we could add to the list if we wanted to expand our parameters. But yeah. Yes, sir.
Where does Lucifer come in, like in Exodus 20, not Ezekiel 28, and fallen and stuff like that?
I had that slide on my PowerPoint, and at the last second I deleted it. But Lucifer is based on an interpretation of Isaiah 14. Maybe we'll talk about that at the very end of our time today. But yeah, Lucifer is a passage kind of like Ezekiel 28. It's an oracle against the king of Babylon, and it describes the king of Babylon as a sort of like a fallen star, like a star that's fallen to the earth. And he refers to the king of Babylon as Hillel ben Shachar, or ben Shachar, which is shiny one, son of the dawn. The Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Old Testament, translate that as Lucifer, light bearer. It's just a translation. Later, people begin to think of Lucifer as a name, but the word Lucifer originally wasn't a name. And as a matter of fact, the word Lucifer wasn't even in the Old Testament. That's from the Latin. So if you're looking in your Bibles for the name Lucifer, you're not going to find it unless you read the King James Version, which is not based on the Hebrew at that point.
Leaving aside the fact that angels and devils and all that kind of thing. Could we look at God as the creator and almighty? Would the devil be his opponent, thinking his powers is almost as equal as God, but not quite?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to talk about the devil as God's enemy in the next segment. But just to get to your main question, I think even though we can speak of the devil as God's enemy, they're not equal, right? Yeah, I mean, there's no passage in the Bible at all that suggests that there's any parity. Yeah. One of them is clearly in charge and far more powerful. I mean, God didn't classify himself. There's nothing else that's comparable. So many of the Psalms say, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the heavenly beings?" There's no one on heaven or earth that compares with God. Well, I have the invitation at the end of the time.
Can you go back to the Matthew?
Yeah, I
The
believe I
temptation.
can. Oh, which part of Matthew? Here we go.
The part we're preaching on Sunday.
Which part are you preaching on Sunday?
I'm not preaching this Sunday, but I preached it before.
Matthew 4.
So, I think you were leading me to think differently than I have thought. I've often wondered exactly what's going on here.
It's weird.
What's going on here? So you persuaded me to think there was more of a physical encounter between Jesus and somebody than I've ever thought before. I've always put it in dreamland and in a kind of another place. So, is that what you meant to do?
Yeah, I don't think I was making that point about this passage, but I think the assumption you just offers is that Satan is a person. When Satan comes to someone, it's a real, kind of like Satan in Job, going before God. I think the assumption is there's an actual person there. Now, there are people who can do different things theologically with this, but if we're trying to comprehend what the New Testament authors were thinking, what they were assuming, what they intended to communicate, then and I think it's difficult to say that they had something in mind other than a personal being. Not a human being, but a personal being. And it's about time to take a break, but one more.
So Jesus told Peter to get thee behind me, Satan. I mean, just after he had commended him for being a rock that he's going to build his church on.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit?
Yeah. Gosh, the way that's traditionally understood is Jesus and trying to prevent Jesus, or Peter and trying to prevent Jesus from accomplishing his mission would be kind of representing the desire of Satan at that point. There's some other things going on in that text, and it'd take a few minutes for us to get into them, but I think that would be the way that it would be interpreted. And if Dr. Williams is more familiar with the passage and wants to weigh in here, he's welcome to.
And not that Peter was the rock, but his statement was the rock.
That's a very Protestant thing to say. Now, if you're Roman Catholic, you would say that Peter is the rock. But I'm Protestant, so I'm fine with you saying that. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to every time he saw me. Like it was funny the first 40 times. Yeah, but that was the first time for you, so it was funny. She said she was stoked. I was stoked. Yeah. They liked it over here too. A little sip of juice there, make sure my palate can continue. Let's see here. Where are we? There we go. Part 2. More complex aspects of New Testament theology. By the way, I love the questions. It's difficult to y'all are really intelligent and very knowledgeable of the Bible. And so some of the questions you're asking are difficult to answer sufficiently in a short span of space in this context. But I'm happy to talk with you, after the session, and as I was talking to some of you between sessions, and continue to ask me as we go along as well. I'm happy to take them, but some of them just for the sake of time and keeping us moving along, I have to defer to postpone answering until after we're together. We'll see how this goes. The more complex aspects of New Testament Satanology. This is a real test. Maybe that's not an inappropriate word. Or a real test of my ability to communicate. Not because you have been great, but because these ideas do get to be a little more complex, and we have to be very careful to word things accurately as well as clearly. But that's what we're going to do. What I'm going to try to do is. So here's what we've seen so far. Satan is a person, and by person I do not mean human being, but a personal being, someone with a will who can act independently. Even if within certain limitations. Someone asked me about Satan being more of a symbol or an idea for the darkness in the world, the darkness in our hearts. And that's certainly one way that Christian traditions, especially more recently, have dealt with some of these texts. However, the biblical authors themselves don't seem to have that in mind. They seem to be speaking of an actual personal entity. When they're talking about Satan. Satan is depicted in the New Testament as a tester, tempter, deceiver, and as the leader of evil spirits / demons / angels. All right, now here's where we get to be perhaps a little more complicated. Number 4. We've talked about how in the Old Testament, Satan is a punisher of sinners. Actually, this idea continues not only into early Judaism, but appears in a handful of passages in the New Testament as well. That Satan is the one who is responsible for killing people who rebel against God, or afflicting people physically who need correction from God. Let me give you just a few examples of this. Hebrews 2:14-15. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself is talking about Jesus here. Jesus himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death. That is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. So Satan is the one who has the power of death. And by Jesus's death, he renders Satan powerless. Satan is no longer able to bring about the death that Satan wants to bring about because of what Christ did. Let me be a little more, that may be a bit abstract. I want to start there. I really like that verse because not only does it seem to conceive of Satan as someone who brings death, but also it talks about Christ's defeat of Satan and rendering Satan powerless in that respect. But let's look at another passage that may be somewhat familiar to you. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul is dealing with a case of especially egregious sexual immorality in the church that's in Corinth. And actually a man is sleeping with his father's wife, presumably his stepmom. And Paul said that this is not good. This is worse than even non-Christians behave. This is not only bad for a church, this is bad for everyone, by everyone's standards. Here's what Paul says. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you of the sort of sexual immorality that is not found even among Gentiles. For a man is living with his father's wife, and you are arrogant. Should you not rather have warrants that he who has done this would have been removed from among you? For I, though absent in body, am present in spirit, and as if present, I have already pronounced judgment in the name of the Lord Jesus on the man who has done such a thing. Here's how the passage continues. When you are assembled, and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, you are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that the spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. Yeah. It seems like Paul has in mind here the church handing a person into the power of Satan who's going to afflict him physically in some way, which will hopefully have a salvific result that will straighten this person up.
Yes.
But here you have Satan who's being in charge of destroying this person's flesh, but in effect restoring this person to God. Now there are different ways of interpreting this. I shouldn't get up here and present this as the only way of reading this passage. It's my way of reading the passage, and I think it's right. I think this. I very rarely intentionally misinterpret the Bible. So I normally think that I'm right. When my wife and I have a disagreement, she says, "You always think that you're right." I said, "Of course I always think. I hardly ever think that I'm wrong and say, you know what, I'm just going to be wrong. I always think that I'm right." What I also know better than to say is, well, you think that you're right too, or we wouldn't be arguing. But I've learned in years of marriage. My father-in-law wants to say, by the way. So I'm glad he's really excited that he and my mother-in-law moved here, and I'm glad that he's joined us today. So I think that I'm right, but there are other ways of reading this passage. Some scholars believe that this refers to excommunication. The church here is simply to remove this person from fellowship with them. There's no real fleshly attack going on. Satan is not causing any problems for this person, except for the fact that the person is kicked out of the church and somehow in the domain of Satan. There's another scholar who suggests that maybe what Satan is doing here is causing psychological anguish. When the person is kicked out of the church, this person is going to be really, really sad and find it difficult to exist outside of the church and be restored because of the psychological anguish that occurs. But when we consider this passage in light of the others that we've looked at in the Old Testament and in early Judaism, where Satan is running around causing people physical problems because of their sin, and you have the use of the word flesh here, and which sounds a whole lot like Job as well, where Satan goes and tells God, let's strike his flesh. I think that I'm confident, maybe overly confident, but I feel confident this is talking about Satan afflicting someone physically. And the effect of this is to be restored. This person is supposed to be turned back to God because of this. Yes?
So, do we have an office of Satan that we need to create or something?
Well, that's a good question. Like, how do we do this? Like there's 5 people at my church right now. I'm kidding. I like people at my church. But yeah, how do we put this into practice? And I don't know. That's a great question. Sometimes it's easier to see what they were thinking than it is to figure out how that applies to our own lives. That's why I'm a Bible professor and not a preacher. So I do preach, but maybe it's why I'm a Bible professor and not a theologian or something like that. But yeah, it's easier for me to see what they kind of had in mind than to figure out how does that apply to us. I mean, church discipline is something that we could probably benefit from, but do we hand people over to Satan and ask Satan to afflict people with that? I would have to think a little more about that, I think.
Wouldn't that be a position?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the Inquisition, the church was doing the destruction of the flesh themselves, and not trusting in Satan. That's one thing that you get in the Bible. You do get these difficult passages where people are asking God to do bad things to their enemies, and here the church is handing someone over to Satan. But one good thing is they're not doing it to this person themselves. They are leaving it to God, and which is unlike the Inquisition, as I understand the Inquisition at least. There's another passage that's really similar to this, 1 Timothy 1:19-20. Here it says, by rejecting conscience, certain persons have suffered shipwreck in the faith. Among them are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have turned over to Satan, so that they may be taught not to blaspheme. Handed them over to Satan or turned them over to Satan so that they may be taught not to blaspheme. Interesting. Satan as a punisher, punishing people and disciplining them and perhaps even turning them back to God. Tough love, yeah. Here's a fun one that you've probably read before. 2 Corinthians 12:7. Paul here is talking about some really impressive visions that he's had, even a journey to heaven, perhaps that he's had. And what he says here is that, therefore, to keep me from becoming too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh. This is Paul's thorn in the flesh. Thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from becoming too elated. Now, let me throw a little another bit of information. I didn't put this in the PowerPoint, but the word messenger there is angelos. So it could also be translated angel. Is Paul's thorn in the flesh? And scholars and interpreters, they disagree widely about what it means that Paul has a thorn in the flesh. Does he have migraine headaches? Is it a problem with his eyes or something else? And in my mind, I just don't think we have enough information to diagnose exactly what Paul was experiencing, except that according to Paul, this was a fleshly affliction that was brought on by a messenger or an angel of Satan. And it's to keep him from getting too big for his britches, as my parents would probably say. A couple other texts, maybe these aren't as clear, I don't think, but just as long as we're talking about maybe Satan being a punisher of sinners, are there any other texts that we might reread or read differently in this light? Oops, 1 Corinthians 11:29 through 30, talking about people who are taking part in Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. And here's what Paul says: for all who eat and drink without discerning the body, eat and drink judgment against themselves. For this reason, many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. Here you have a passage where people are getting sick and dying because of the way they're mistaking, they're wrongfully taking the Lord's Supper. And then, did Paul consider this to be Satan who was the one who was making them sick and dying? He doesn't say here, but worth considering, especially given what Paul says a few chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians about handing someone over to Satan for the destruction of his flesh. And let's see here. There we go. 1 Peter 5:8, discipline yourselves, keep alert. Like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour. What is this talking about? What does it look like when the devil devours someone? I mean, this is obviously a metaphor. Satan is not a lion, and he's not eating people, right? So this is he's using figurative language here. I guess my question is, what reality, to what literal sort of event is 1 Peter referring here? We talked about the devil prowling around looking for someone to devour. Maybe he's looking for people who are sinning, like in Job, where he's traveling around observing who's righteous and who's sinning. And when he finds someone who's sinning, then he devours them like a lion.
Well, that's like doing the work of God.
It is kind of like that, isn't it?
But God works it out.
Yeah, and that's why this is in the complex section of our lecture, because it does look kind of like Satan is an employee of God in certain respects. Now, that's not the entire story. We're going to look at some other things in a moment. That's not the entire story, but it looks like Satan, kind of like he is in the Old Testament and like he is in some early Jewish texts, is punishing sinners on behalf of God.
I had an old doctor that put it this way: the devil is God's sheepdog.
Okay.
And are you going to bring up Ephesians 6:12?
I wasn't going to bring that up. You want to bring it up? I think you just did.
Well, it says that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities in the realm of darkness and the heavenly places. And for Jesus, when he did what he did, he became ruler and authority over all powers and principalities. And he gave that on to his church.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll talk about that. I think my next point is going to be more along, I'm not going to mention that text in particular, but we're wrestling with powers and principalities, and we take up the shield of faith by which we extinguish the fiery darts of the evil one. I believe it's the evil one that has, but Satan is mentioned explicitly in that passage as well as someone that we're going to battle with. All right. Any questions about Satan punishing sinners? I know we're not just thinking of Satan this way. Satan is kind of trying to get us to sin and causing others problems for us. But we do have some texts in the New Testament that talk about Satan causing problems for sinners on God's behalf.
Well, it says God's not mocked, whatever we sow, we also reap. So it's a matter of choice. If you choose something dumb, it won't suffer some dumb consequences.
Yeah. So, yeah, and that's probably my main point of this whole thing. Don't be dumb. Because there will be some consequences. All right. So, but not only is Satan the attacker and executioner of sinners, but in the New Testament, he is the evil one and God's enemy. So when I say in certain respects, he seems to be carrying out God's work of punishing sinners or even correcting the righteous. That's not the whole story. There is this point, this part that we're probably more familiar with, much more familiar with, that Satan is God's enemy. God is and the evil one. I'm not saying that Satan is a good guy. That's not what I'm saying. It's probably a little more complex than we've often thought. But Satan certainly is someone who's evil and God's enemy according to the New Testament. Now, when you start looking for passages in the New Testament that say that Satan is God's enemy, it does get a little tricky. But I think you have a few passages that do imply this. 1 John 3:8-10, everyone who commits sin is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. I mean, that's not good. He's not just punishing the wicked. He's actually sinning himself. The Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. Those who have been born of God do not sin because God's seed abides in them. They cannot sin because they've been born of God. The children of God and the children of the devil are revealed in this way. All who do not do what is right are not from God, nor are those who do not love a brother or a sister. So you can either be associated with God or you can be associated with the devil. There are two groups of human beings, according to this text. You're associated with God or you're associated with the devil. So God and the devil are opposed to one another. It's not just Satan running around working for God, punishing sinners. They're at odds with one another, representing two different groups of humans, two different kingdoms. Matthew 25:41, we've already seen this verse. Then he will say to those at his left hand, you who are cursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. What does it mean that the devil and his angels are bound for eternal fire? Yeah, the devil's bad, right? God is not going to put someone in the lake of fire or in the eternal fire who is simply serving God. I think the implication is that Satan is sinful and in rebellion against God. And that's actually what we have. We have the lake of fire itself mentioned in Revelation 20. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So Satan clearly is in rebellion against God and is God's enemy. Now, as we said earlier, Satan is not he's not a formidable opponent of God. He's not an equal. It's not like we have two powers. There's God on one hand, the devil on one hand. They're both equally powerful. It's not like the cartoons I watched when I was a kid where you have a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other one. The force of good in the universe, God is clearly far superior to Satan, but they are at odds. They are at odds. Satan as the accuser. Now, this is probably something you've heard a whole lot. If you've done much reading or thinking or heard some teaching about Satan at all, this is one that often gets emphasized in Christian teaching. Kind of strangely so, there's not a whole lot of evidence for this in the New Testament. We do have one verse in the New Testament that refers to Satan as the accuser, and another verse in that same book that may describe Satan going about the work of accusation. But we don't really have a lot of references to Satan as the accuser in the New Testament. The way this is normally taught is that Satan, as the accuser, is like a heavenly prosecuting attorney. And he keeps track of things that people do that are wrong. And then he goes before God and reports those things to God, saying, hey, Chris Shoemate was going 11 miles over the speed limit on the way to work this morning, and you need to give him a flat tire, or something like that. But we don't have any story like that in the New Testament, any story where Satan goes before God and reports that someone has been sinning. So what does it mean that Satan is the accuser? The verse that I'm talking about that calls Satan the accuser is found in Revelation 12. This is where there's the war in heaven. You have Michael and his angels on one side, Satan or the dragon and his angels on the other side. Eventually, Satan and his forces are defeated. And what it says is John Revelation says, then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, now has come the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our brothers and sisters has been thrown down. The old NRSV, this is the NRSV updated edition that just came out last year. The old one said the accuser of our comrades, which sounds like the Soviet Union or something like that. And I use the NRSV in my book, and so I had comrades there, but I hated every second of typing the word comrade. The new NRSV changed it to brothers and sisters, which I think is better than comrades. But here you have Satan called the accuser of our brothers and sisters. He's been thrown down, who accuses them day and night for our God. So what does Revelation mean when it refers to Satan as the accuser of our brothers and sisters? Because we don't have any stories of him being a prosecuting attorney. And what we do have, however, are a small number of stories like we have in Job, where Satan goes before God and says, hey, God, let's test these people that you think are faithful. Let's test them. And I think that's probably what it's talking about here when it refers to Satan as the accuser. And we actually get a passage kind of like this in Revelation 2. Actually, so from 12:10 to 2:10, just kind of take the one off the front of it. And here's where John tells one of the churches, gosh, I cannot even remember which church it is. So he tells one of the churches, he's writing letters to 7 churches at the very beginning. He says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. And so I think this is what Revelation is talking about when it talks about Satan being the accuser. Satan's not a prosecuting attorney. He's not going before God and reporting what you've done wrong. However, according to Revelation, one of the things that Satan does, at least prior to his defeat, Revelation 12 talks about a defeat of Satan, after which Satan won't be able to do this. But one of the things that he does, according to Revelation, prior to his defeat, is come before God and say, hey, God, let's test these people. And in this particular church, he's throwing them into prison for 10 days. If the people are faithful, if they pass the test, things will go great for them. If they don't pass the test, not so well. I was about to say not so hot, but unfortunately, it would be quite hot according to Revelation. So is Satan the accuser? There's one book in the New Testament that talks about that, and he's an accuser in the sense of he goes before God and gets permission to test Christians. All right, serpent. Now, some of you asked me, this has come up as a question, I think, just about every week we've been together. Because the first week I said, Genesis 3 does not say that Satan is the serpent. And I will stand by that statement. Maybe you've had a chance to reread Genesis 3 since we got together. Or maybe you read Genesis 3 and didn't find Satan there, so you went back and read Genesis 1 and 2, thinking maybe it mentioned it, and no. And you read Genesis 4, it's not there. And Satan is not actually mentioned in Genesis at all.
The last point you made, Luke 22:31, where Jesus said, Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example of him really coming before Jesus.
Good point. Yeah, that
And
passage.
say, I want to do this.
Yeah, so maybe you're familiar with the passage where Jesus tells Peter that Satan has asked permission to sift him like wheat, and Jesus says, once this is passed, I will restore you, or something like that. It is difficult to know exactly what Jesus has in mind there, but maybe it's this sort of test where Satan's going to test Simon, and once Simon has come through it, he'll be restored. But it's hard to know what exactly Jesus is talking about there. He doesn't explain it more fully than one or two sentences there. So Satan used, I have serpent up here because although Genesis does not say that, I know some of you were stretching your neck, I was just about to pick up the screen and hold up here, but I don't think that would do the trick, unfortunately. But Genesis does not say that the serpent is Satan. However, there are a couple of passages in the New Testament that refer to Satan as a sort of serpent, okay? So what are those passages and what are they talking about? So what I want to do right now is give you 4 things to consider about Satan and the relationship Satan and his relationship with the serpent. First of all, when the New Testament authors speak explicitly about Genesis 3, I edited this and didn't correct that. When the New Testament authors speak explicitly about Genesis 3, they do not mention Satan. So there are several passages in the New Testament where they talk about the fall of humankind. They talk about Adam and Eve and their sin. They even talk about them being deceived or tempted, but they do not mention Satan when they do this. Let me give you I'm missing a page here. Let's see here. There we go. It was out of order, I guess. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11, but I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by its cunning, your thoughts will be led astray from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. So here Paul is talking about in the first human woman being deceived, and he says the serpent deceived her. He doesn't mention Satan. In 1 Timothy 2, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman. Now that's a conversation for another time. What's going on in this passage? Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. But for our purposes, no mention of Satan here. Mention of deception, but no mention of Satan. I apologize for these being out of order here. So the New Testament authors speak explicitly about Genesis 3. They do not mention Satan. Next point, the connection of Satan with Genesis 3. I'm sorry, but my second point's on top there. I'm not sure how this happened. The connection of Satan with Genesis 3 should be understood in the context of other Jewish interpretations of Old Testament passages in light of their belief in Satan. And this is what I was getting at the very beginning of our time together today, looking at the book of Jubilees and how they're reading these Old Testament stories and bringing Satan into these stories where Satan didn't initially appear, where you have the Abraham's test, and the book of Jubilees rewrites Abraham's test, so that's kind of like the story of Job, where Satan is involved. Or the Exodus, where Satan is trying to kill Moses, and Satan is helping the Egyptian magicians, when Satan originally wasn't part of these stories. And so when we have Satan mentioned in the context of Genesis 3, what we have going on here are the New Testament authors or other Jewish authors reading Genesis 3 and saying, you know what? Genesis doesn't say that the serpent was Satan, but it sure would make a lot of sense if Satan were involved in those events. And so that's the interpretive process that I think begins to associate Satan with that serpent, or begin to bring these two traditions, the tradition of the Garden of Eden and the sin of the first human couple, and Satan. It brings those into conversation with each other, just like disbelief in Satan is brought into conversation with other Old Testament stories. All right, let me give you another thing to keep in mind, or another thing to consider as we're thinking of Satan and the serpent. There are actually multiple Old Testament serpents that New Testament authors seem to have in mind. When New Testament authors are talking about Satan as a serpent, as the book of Revelation does, is probably the clearest example, when it refers to Satan as the ancient serpent, which serpent does John in Revelation have in mind? Now, we think immediately of the serpent of Genesis 3 who tempted Adam and Eve, but there are other really scary, important serpents in the Old Testament. One of them is Leviathan. Isaiah 27:1, on that day the Lord. Yeah, that's right. He mentioned in Job. I think I give you just examples from Isaiah, but you find some of these figures in Job and in Psalms too. But in Isaiah 27:1, on that day the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. So Leviathan is this serpent or dragon that God defeats. Isaiah 51:9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Rahab is elsewhere. Maybe Job, elsewhere called the serpents, involves the dragon in Isaiah 51. So we have these other serpents who are at odds with God in the Old Testament that God defeats. Yeah, Moses has a staff that turns into a serpent as well. Keep that in mind. We'll come to Revelation 12 in just a second. But last thing to consider, New Testament authors are more interested in using Old Testament imagery to characterize Satan than using Satan to explain Old Testament passages. So you don't have the New Testament authors doing exactly what you have in Jubilees, where they're interpreting these Old Testament passages and they're using Satan to explain these passages. New Testament authors, at least the ones who mention Satan in the context of the serpent, are more interested in taking these images, these ideas from the Old Testament, and using them to explain Satan. That makes sense. It's one thing to use Satan to explain an Old Testament passage. It's another thing to use an Old Testament passage to explain Satan. And I think it's that latter, using an Old Testament idea or an Old Testament concept to explain who Satan is, that we have going on in the New Testament. So now we come to Revelation chapter 12. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now this sounds kind of like Leviathan, doesn't it? This dragon, this great dragon that's defeated by God. However, you also have this idea of Satan deceiving the whole world, and that sounds kind of like the serpent in Genesis 3, where the serpent deceives all of humankind. And so in Revelation, my guess is John in Revelation is taking both the serpent of Genesis 3 and this story about Leviathan that gets mentioned, this dragon that God defeated in a couple of Old Testament passages, and he's combining them together and using these images to explain who Satan is. I don't know that John is saying that Satan was involved in Genesis 3. Satan is the one who led Adam and Eve astray. He may be. That's not as clear to me. What's more clear to me is he's taking that image of that serpent and explaining who Satan is. Think of Revelation. In Revelation, when the book of Revelation talks about Rome, what does Revelation call Rome? Babylon. So he refers to Rome as Babylon. If there's a false teacher in the church, he'll call the false teacher Jezebel or something like that. And he's not saying that, hey, everywhere you have Babylon in the Old Testament, that's really Rome. Or everywhere you have Jezebel in the Old Testament, that's really this false teacher. What he's doing is taking these images from the Old Testament and using them to explain the challenges that the church laid in the first century AD, at that time, that they're encountering. He's not as concerned about explaining the Old Testament passages as he is in using the Old Testament concepts or images to explain what's going on. Now, it may very well be that John believed that Satan was involved with that serpent in the garden. I wouldn't be surprised at all. That makes a whole lot of sense. You know, if Satan is bad and the deceiver, like the New Testament says that he is, it would make sense. But John is more concerned here about talking about who Satan is now than what he did, back in the book of Genesis. Same thing, I think, in Romans 16, verses 19 through 20. Paul says, for your obedience is known to all, therefore I rejoice over you. But I want you to be wise in what is good and guileless in what is evil. The God of peace will shortly crush Satan under your feet. This may be an allusion to Genesis 3:15, where God says that the seed of woman, or that Satan will strike the heel of the woman's seed, and that the woman's seed will crush crush Satan's or the serpent's head. There are other psalms that kind of sound like this too, where God subordinates all the nations and the beasts of the earth under the feet of Israel. And actually, the language of this passage sounds more like those texts than like Genesis 3:15. But this could be a reference to Genesis 3:15. You do have, being wise in what is good and guileless in what is evil. That sounds like Genesis 3, doesn't it? But this may be another one of those passages that's referring to numerous or multiple earlier traditions, one of which is Genesis 3. But still, Paul's point here is not so much to explain what happened in Genesis 3 as it is to promise, using that imagery from the Old Testament, or that language from the Old Testament, that one day God is going to defeat Satan. So things to keep in mind as we interpret, ask the question of, is Satan the serpent? Let me go off script for just a second. If you ask me, do I think Satan was the serpent? Satan was associated with the serpent in Genesis 3? I would say yes. Like, that makes so much sense to me that how could the enemy of God, this primary opponent, this primary advocate of wickedness, how could that person not be involved back then? So theologically, I would say yes, but I would also say that Genesis doesn't say that. That's something that I'm thinking theologically, me trying to make sense of all the things that the Bible says, not me just reading Genesis and seeing what Genesis said. All right. So here are things, there are other things that we could say about Satan in the New Testament. Some of these are probably pretty easy to wrap your minds around, and some of these are a little more difficult. In my mind, that the real complexity comes in how we relate numbers 4 and 5 with each other. How can Satan be both someone who serves God as a punisher of sinners, but also is the evil one who's in rebellion against God? And I don't think there's any easy answer to this. Satan is probably, if I were to summarize in one sentence what I've discovered about Satan in my research, that he's a more complex figure than we often give him credit for being. It's not quite as simple as we often assume when it comes to Satan. Now, we like simplicity. This is a picture. I have no idea where this picture came from. I found it on the internet some years ago, and I really like it because it makes really clear stereotypes, good and bad. And you have the good guy, and it says good guy under him. And the bad guy says bad guy under him. The good guy is clean shaven. The bad guy has a mustache and 5 o'clock shadow or a 2-day shadow. I don't know. The good guy's smiling. The bad guy's frowning and kind of got eyes and eyebrows that are unhappy. Good guy wearing a white hat. Bad guy wearing a black hat. You have a bird. I don't know if you see the bird in the good guy picture, and you got a snake in the bad guy picture. There are horses. The good guy has a white horse that is also smiling. The bad guy has a brown horse that is also frowning. If only life were just simple. Like, the good people are all good and the bad people are all bad. God is all good. Jesus Christ is all good. The rest of us are kind of a mix, aren't we? And we know that life isn't really this simple. We know that in real life, even the best people aren't perfect. That's why it's so dangerous to put our heroes up on a pedestal, because they could very easily fall, right? And we also appreciate most of the time that even the bad people sometimes mean well. Maybe they're just confused or they're not all bad. I'm not going to mention any politicians today. Pick your most hated politician, whoever that may be, and you know that person is not all bad. Okay. Maybe there's room for debate, some of them, but generally speaking, we know that people aren't all, except for God, people aren't all good, and I haven't met anyone who's all bad. And when we come to the Bible, I think it helps sometimes when we read the Bible, and the Bible is appropriately complicated. The Bible is not giving us an overly simplistic picture of good and evil. I mean, if the Bible gave us a really simple answer to good and evil, it would be wrong, because good and evil is a complex issue. And one of the great things about the Bible is that it deals in an appropriately complex way with complex issues. I was speaking with President Humble a few weeks ago about the book of Job, and he and I are both big fans of the book of Job. And how many, did you identify 14 explanations of evil in the book of Job? See, I identified like 5 or 6, and so, but I'm sure you're right. There are so many different facets of this problem that one simple explanation will not do it justice. One of the great things about the Bible is it doesn't try to give us a simple answer to a really tough question. It gives us a complex answer to a complex question. So when we come across Satan, the relationship between Satan and God, evil, why we experience evil, why we do evil, it makes a lot of sense that it's not just a really simple answer that we can communicate in one sentence. I mean, maybe we talk about the fall. Maybe that would be one short answer. But even that, I don't know that would do it justice if you just give a one sentence answer. And so I'm really encouraged. Like my faith in the Bible grows when I see the complexity in the Bible because you know that the Bible is not insufficient to address what I see in life. Not insufficient to address the problems of the world as I see them. The Bible takes on these complex issues in a complex manner, including what it teaches us about Satan. That is all that I have. We're about out of time, but I got a little bit of time for questions. Thank you. Before I forget, thank you so much for being here. Tusculum. And there are 4.5 minutes for questions. Is that okay? Can we do that? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, an example, they clearly was on the slide, Satan punishes people for their sin.
Mm-hmm.
And that explains illness.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus, when he heals the blind man, and they ask him, who sinned, his parents or this man? And Jesus said, I think neither
Right.
one.
Right.
This was to glorify God.
Sure.
But, you know, it seems like he's not on that side. Or maybe I'm
That's a good observation. So your observation is Paul is explaining illness, at least in some cases, saying this is from Satan and it relates to sin. Jesus, on the other hand, in the Gospel of John, he heals this person who was born blind, and Jesus is in response to the question of whose sin resulted in this man's blindness, Jesus said, no one's sin. This isn't related to sin. I wouldn't see those two answers in conflict with each other. It's kind of like the book of Job, where you have 14 different explanations for evil. One explanation of evil is we bring it on ourselves, or one explanation of sin or of bad things that happen to us is we bring it on ourselves. We're guilty and deserve what we get. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we suffer for no fault of our own, or no fault even of our parents. And so I don't know that Paul and Jesus are at odds there as much as they're addressing different circumstances. And in some cases, we suffer because of our sin. In other cases, we suffer despite our innocence. Does that make sense? Yes.
Just want to say one more thing. If God is, and he is omniscient, and he knew all this before he even made the earth. And he had already devised a plan for man's redemption. Doesn't it stand to reason that he can use Satan, because Satan is lower than he is? And whether it was a serpent that he allowed to talk to Eve, or if it was the devil, kind of makes no difference, because he knew man was going to sin. And in relation to Satan, and he would use Satan because God is good. So he had to have somebody to exact the judgment or the punishment, and to do the punishment on sinners.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. So is Satan like the Kraken, who God releases on occasion? This Kraken just goes out destroying it, and not a very intelligent monster.
Well, and he also knew that they were going to leave heaven. So, I mean, he knew that already. So, just like he, can use different things here in Romans 8:28, bad things that turns around for good, can he not use Satan?
Yeah, and so I think the distinction you're making is Satan taking orders from God, or is Satan just this rebel that God is able to kind of direct by releasing him sometimes and protecting people from him other times?
Everything he does is allowed by God.
Right. Yes, and he has to get permission from God before he touches it. Yes. Yeah. And I think we often like to explain it that way, where Satan is just this guy going around causing all kinds of trouble, but God protects us from Satan in some cases and allows Satan to do bad stuff in others. I think that's easier to reconcile with this idea that Satan is all bad and Satan doesn't work for God. But what we seem to have in these texts is somebody who's taking orders from God, and not just like the Kraken that gets released every once in a while, but someone who's more of a thinking, rational person. Who in some cases, in some instances, is in rebellion against God, in other cases, is doing exactly what God tells him to do. So, to answer your question, that would be one way of thinking of it. On the other hand, maybe God has a more active role, where Satan is even more subservient to God than we often acknowledge. But God's in control either way. Yeah, I think that was your main point. Oh, one last question. Yes, sir. You haven't asked a question yet, so yes, you can ask a question.
I'm just curious about those that are come from a creedal church. Jesus descended to the dead. He went to hell and freed the souls. Where was Satan?
Yeah, great question. Now, I just had this conversation with my pastor not long ago about the Apostles' Creed and about whether that descend to the hell or descend to the dead or just leave out that expression altogether. And I was more on the side of, I interpret 1 Peter a little differently. I did find out that Dr. Williams interprets it differently from the way that I do. And so he would probably be the better person to answer that question. Where was Satan? But in theory, where was Satan during all of that? You don't get the impression in the Old Testament or in the Bible that Satan is currently in hell, or Satan is the king of hell, or anything like that. Satan is out and about running around doing things. So this idea that Satan is currently in hell, ruling over hell, I don't see that anywhere in the Bible. So assuming that passage is about Jesus descending into the netherworld or into the dead, I don't know that he would bump into Satan while he was making that trip. So, that's my answer. But there are other people in the stream that are more qualified to answer that specific question than I am. All right.
You promised me an answer this week. And the question was, if the chosen people were banished from Israel or wherever they were, enslaved in Egypt, enslaved in Babylon, crucified or burned through the chambers in the Nazi Germany, where was the devil in that?
Of course, the Bible doesn't speak specifically about I'm a Bible scholar, so if it happened in the 1st century, I can give you a really good answer, or earlier. If it happened in the 20th century, then it would be speculation on my part. But based on what I know about Satan from the New Testament, that would have been something that he was very much involved in. But death and suffering and those sorts of things, especially against people that God has shown favor. But that is speculation on my part, I wish I could give you a better answer. Those were egregious, awful atrocities. And my assumption would be that Satan was right in the midst of that.
Dr. Stokes, thank you very much. Appreciate your willingness to share your wisdom with us, and we very much respect the work and research you put into this. So thank you for sharing the fruit of that labor with us this month. Before we are dismissed, head down to lunch. Dr. Dan, would you come up? Dr. Dan Donaldson is going to say a prayer for us as we close. But before we do that, we did promise you that we go ahead and share with you information about next year's Theologian Residence program. So if I can find my slide. Next year's speaker will be Emily Morrell. She is from this area. She has a Master of Divinity degree from Columbia Theological Seminary. She's currently a doctoral student history at West Virginia University. She will be sharing with us about religion in Appalachia, faith in the mountains in the past, present, and future. So we are already excited about that. Hope you'll go ahead and put it on your calendar and make plans to be with us next February for that series. So once again, thank you for being here. Dr. Dan, would you close us with a word of prayer today?
I will, and I will say again, a word of thanks to Tusculum University, to Dr. Shoemate, Dr. Hummel, Dr. Williams, to the institutional advancement staff, to Chartwells, and all the folks who have been instrumental in making this happen. Look forward to next year. I know Emily, and she's a wonderful scholar, and I think it will be wonderfully engaging as well. Dr. Stubbs, thanks you again very much. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you being here. Let's pray. Gracious God, we give thanks for this day, the gift that you have given us, the gift of fellowship together, the gift of learning and opportunity to engage your word and seek to understand your will and way, and the gift of your word in our lives and the life of the world and the church. We give thanks for all the good gifts, all those who have contributed to this time together, Dr. Stokes and others. We give thanks for this food that will nourish us, for we know that you are the giver of all good gifts. For you, by your gifts, sustain us by your spirit, and by this food today and the fellowship at these tables. Hear all our thanks. We pray your continued blessing on and guidance on the mission and ministry of Tusculum University. And we give thanks that we have had this time to be together, and we pray this all in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.